ancient civilizations, epic strategy battles, third-person hero combat, and a David vs Goliath struggle between a talented developer and the greedy publisher that pulled the rug out from right under them. It can only mean one thing. Hi, I'm Kaluven, and today we're going to talk about Rise and Fall: Civilizations at War, an interesting game with an even more interesting story behind it. Before we start to put our spoons into this particular pudding, I want to prepare you for what's ahead. You see, when I started writing the script, I was going to open with my usual bit of background and then spend the next 10 minutes talking about the game. However, once I dug a little deeper into the dish, it quickly became apparent that the accepted knowledge about the project is founded on little more than hearsay and doesn't quite tally up with some of the empirical evidence. This is interesting, and to me, far more interesting than the game itself. So instead of my usual format, we're going to do things a bit differently. For starters, I'm going to tell you the brief story as it appears on several forums, Wikipedia articles and reviews. For the main course, I'm going to show you the game, and for dessert, we're going to have a nice long chat about the relationships between publishers and studios, discuss the game development deals of the 2000s, and talk a bit about how it can go wrong. After that, I'm going to share what I think is a more plausible theory about what really went down during the creation of Rise and Fall. Since I've totally exhausted this meal-based analogy, let's get on with it. Rise and Fall was a project initiated by Stainless Steel Studios, the creators of the extremely ambitious and much loved Empire Earth. Just like Empire Earth, it was the brainchild of Rick Goodman, the owner of Stainless Steel and the lead designer behind Age of Empires. After Empire Earth's release, Stainless parted way with Sierra and struck up a deal with a new publisher in the form of Activision, releasing a follow-up title called Empires: Dawn of the Modern World just a few years later. Like Empire Earth, this game was also a commercial and critical success, earning very respectable reviews and sales figures. However, just as it was with Sierra, Rick didn't feel that Activision could support his creative vision and struck up a deal with Midway Games, aiming to release their next product in October 2005. Before this could happen, disaster struck. With the product in great shape and the game just 2 weeks away from going gold, Midway pushed the release date back by 5 months and refused to provide Stainless Steel with any more funding. This forced the Surprise studio into immediate closure, their online presence disappeared and all of their staff were let go. Midway then finished the game themselves and released it the following June, and it was met with a resounding meh by reviewers and players alike. A quick apology about the performance of some of the footage you're seeing. This game is a nightmare to get working on modern systems. It uses some horrific Russian-made DRM called Starforce, a particularly egregious piece of software that gives itself backdoor root access to your system via a special driver. It's such an invasive security hole that Microsoft started to block the thing in more recent versions of Windows, and as such you need to download a crack to make even a legitimate version of the game work. This crack, as well as a defunct but fixed up free version of the game and other bits, are available from a few sources, but as a rule I don't download and run untrustworthy software on my main rig. So what you're seeing is a legitimate physical copy of the game running on an old 5350 APU machine powered by Windows XP, and as such it's quite hard to record high-def full-screen video without impacting the performance somewhat. How did I get a physical copy? Well, that's the easy part. I went old school. I took a walk down the high street, avoided the local Jesus salesman, popped into an exchange store and took a look at the tiny half shelf of PC games they have jammed in between the Xbox and Wii games. I went up to the counter and after parting with a single £1 coin, I was the proud owner of the original retail box, complete with manual and product key. As a quick aside, I feel it's important when I'm showing these games to use a legitimate original copy when I can. For one thing, my channel's monetized, and although the money I earn from each video would barely cover the cost of a cheeseburger, it would be wrong to savour that rich, beefy goodness without making some small contribution somewhere. From a far more pragmatic point of view, I want to show you the game as it was on release, without modern improvements or third-party additions. On top of this, I like to feature games that you could try yourself, even if your own funds are severely limited. I never want to be one of those YouTubers who sits in their $600 Secret Labs chair telling you about the third digital deluxe game package they bought that week. Anyway, I'm losing my focus again, so let's drag this back on track. The game itself is an interesting beast that's pretty hard to describe in a single sentence. At its very core, it's a historical-inspired RTS focusing on the first millennium BCE, featuring the ancient empires of Persia, Greece, Egypt and Rome. The unique selling point is that you can take direct control of a powerful hero unit via a third-person mode, and at key moments have a dramatic effect on the battle. It's also marketed as a cinematic and story-driven game that immerses players directly into the action. The majority of the core tenets are very different from most other RTSs of this style. For one thing, you're not really building a city-state or an empire, but instead setting up a military camp. Sheep herders, berry pickers and farmers are nowhere to be seen, and instead your citizens gather wood to build structures and mine gold to pay for your army. They still build town hall style buildings so that you have somewhere to train more workers and return your resources to, but other than that, it's pretty much all focused on the military. There are several production structures for your troops, they vary between the different nations, but generally you get things like barracks, stables and archery ranges. There is one more structure that's got a slightly more civilian name, but building and upgrading it just increases your population cap, so I don't think you can really call it economic. The games tend to start very slow. You get 3 citizens, and it takes 30 seconds to train each additional one. The gold mine has a maximum capacity of 6 workers, and you'll need another 6 for chopping trees, so the first 5 minutes of a game consist of you just clicking the worker button 9 times and then waiting. Once that's out of the way, you've probably got enough gold to create your hero unit. Each nation has got 2 different choices, and once you've made yours, you're locked in for the rest of the game. Your hero starts off at level 1. It's a powerful combat unit, but not one that's going to win you a battle. To increase their level, you need to gain the 3rd resource, called Glory. If you seek Glory, then there are 2 ways to go about it. Firstly, it comes from just about anything that isn't building or gathering. If you explore the map, you get some. If you kill some enemies, you'll get some more. And when your own soldiers lay down their lives, you'll get more still. The second way is to spend some of your gold and lumber on building statues that celebrate your hero. There is no limit on the number of these you can build, so you'll often find them liberally scattered around a base. Once you've got enough glory, you can increase your hero's level to 2, and this is where things start to become very important. Your hero's level operates a bit like your overall tech level, and it's the gatekeeper for most of your nation's upgrades and unlockables. Each of these items costs yet more glory, and includes things like upgrading your soldiers and unlocking more powerful units. It's a pretty self-explanatory system and not one I struggle to get to grips with. You want level 3 swordsman, level up your hero to 3, and then spend glory on the level 3 swordsman upgrade. The more powerful units mostly require a hero level of 4 or 5 to unlock, and include things like battle elephants, war chariots and siege engines. Glory is also used for gaining access to advisors. They differ for each empire, with 3 or 4 being available at each of the 5 levels of hero upgrade. Hiring advisors is probably overselling the feature a bit. They don't appear anywhere in the game world, so it's really just another name for upgrades. Again, it's pretty simple. You go to the screen, you pick an advisor, pay a number of glory points, and then you'll get their benefits. Things like increased health on a particular unit or faster gathering rates for your citizens. The higher level advisors require a higher hero level to obtain and cost more glory, but they do generally have better benefits. The primary reason for wanting to get your hero to level 2 is it activates the direct control mode. When you press Q, you're taken into a third-person view and you can run around the battlefield and cut down your enemies with the push of a mouse button. The amount of time you can spend in this mode is quite limited. Your hero has a stamina bar. Each attack you make reduces this, and when it runs out you're forced back into RTS mode and can't take direct control again until you've got at least 20% of your stamina back. When you're in direct control mode, your hero doesn't actually lose any health, but instead takes damage to their stamina bar. This means it can be quickly drained away if you're not careful, leaving your hero out of position and particularly vulnerable. While in direct control mode, you are ridiculously powerful. See a unit of 60 archers shooting at your men? No problem. Run directly towards them swinging your sword and watch them get punted left and right and drop to the floor dead. It's hard to overstate what a force multiplier a hero with a full stamina bar can be, and as long as you have some supporting troops so they don't get focused down, it's an absolute game changer. I didn't try all of the heroes, but the ones I did generally had a melee and a ranged attack, as well as way to block attacks and a special ability. Caesar called down a bombardment from a distant siege engine, and Alexander healed nearby troops, that sort of thing. You do also have a little bit of control over your other forces in this mode, by way of the charge, follow and guard commands that orders any nearby soldiers to do exactly that. The charge was actually pretty satisfying, as everyone around you lets out a resounding cheer and then belts full pace towards any enemies that you were facing when you press the button. Your stamina bar replenishes in a different manner depending on what sort of game you're playing. In multiplayer or skirmishes, it slowly regenerates over time, but in the single player campaign there is none of this, and instead you have to find and attack certain man-sized wine jugs to replenish your juices. Your hero can't really die, not permanently anyway. If the health bar drops to 0, they will fall to the floor defeated, but then they will respawn at your town hall a few minutes later. Sounds amazing fun, right? In your head, you're probably thinking of something like the combat system from The Witcher 3 or Elden Ring, right in the centre of an epic battle, but stop it, it's not that. I don't know any word to describe it other than janky. The animations are basic, the feedback is almost zero, and 99% of it is just running around in small circles spamming the left mouse button. It's powerful, sure, but it's not enjoyable for any length of time, and it feels more like something from an action fantasy game of the 90s rather than cutting-edge 2005 technology. The problem here is the whole hero thing is absolutely central to the game. You need to take advantage of this feature because of the dramatic power boost that it offers, but it's just simply not satisfying to use. This is compounded by the fact that it's the game's unique selling point, and as such it's overused in the single-player campaign. There are some missions that don't just include heavy amounts of this feature, but actually enforce it for the entire battle. There was one mission I played in the Alexander campaign where the entire thing involved you fighting 5 waves of enemies in a gladiatorial arena. The problem is that the feature is so damn powerful that the actual enemies are a cakewalk to deal with, so to make it actually challenging they had to line the walls and towers with enemies that continually shot you to drain your stamina. Honestly, I almost chucked the towel in at this point. Having 30 archers repeatedly volley me for 15 minutes while I ran around one-shotting spearmen in third person was not why I buy strategy games. The other issue with the third-person mode is how it influences all other aspects of design. Your base buildings need to be huge so that your hero is able to run inside, climb the stairs and look out over the ramparts in direct control mode. But because the game is built on a descendant of the Titan engine that powered Empire Earth, you have a tiny viewport with a rubbish amount of zoom, so when you're in RTS mode you can only fit about 4 structures on your screen at any one time. Outside of direct control mode, things are actually a hell of a lot better. For one thing, the Titan 2.0 engine looks miles better than its predecessor, and for a 2006 3D game it looks quite nice on high resolution with all of the graphics cranked up to max. Unfortunately, my XP machine can't quite handle that when I'm recording, so you'll have to take my word for it. Stainless Steel Studios actually made the Titan 2.0 engine commercially available and started licensing it out for $250,000, so I guess they had to up their game in that regard. They did actually manage to make some money from it too. I'm not quite sure about all of their customers, but I found that Tilted Mill used it when they created Caesar 4. The RTS side of the game is actually quite fun and it has some really interesting mechanics. For one thing, there are some neutral buildings scattered around the map called outposts. You can attack these buildings, and although it takes a bit of work as they do spawn a wave of automated defenders that sally out to beat up your troops, it's worth doing, as each one you destroy and capture increases a little rally counter at the bottom of your screen. This rally counter determines how many soldiers each single build order at the production facility creates without changing the cost. Without any outposts, it starts off somewhere in the region of 3. So if you do manage to capture 3 of these outposts, then your barracks is pouring out 6 swordsmen at a time instead of 3. It adds a nice extra element, especially to skirmish games, as they are very valuable and it means there's more to fight over than just the opposition's base. The grouping is also excellent. Although several are produced at a time, they are still individuals until they get into larger groups. Once you've got 8 or more of the same soldier, then they can form a unit, and as you produce more they can grow up to 64 soldiers on a single controllable entity. Bigger units of troops mean bigger bonuses, and they are far easier to manage and train all at once. That's right, I said train. Rise and Fall also allows you to produce military instructors who can target a unit and then run them through some sword swinging drills. After a short time that unit will level up and get a 5% bonus, an act that can be repeated some 14 times. Each time you do it, the Roman numerals on their banner will increase by 1 and they'll get another 5% bonus. This cumulative effect becomes pretty huge and it gives you a good reason to build, maintain and train an army before you actually need it. Not everything can be trained, as the game also features some larger individual combatants or automated defences. The big stuff like elephants, catapults and chariots operate as singletons, but most of them have their own additional options, like you can train extra archers on top of your elephants to give them better ranged offensive capabilities. The siege engines themselves aren't built at a factory, instead your citizens knock them up in situ with their ever-trusty hammers. I particularly enjoyed the siege towers and loved how they rolled up to the enemy wall and deployed their boarding planks, while your troops scaled the ladders inside to make their way up to the ramparts. You can also use these to get your hero up there with the direct control mode, and probably half the reason why this system exists in the first place. The automated defences for your town halls and towers are also a whole new way of doing things. Rather than these buildings just shooting any enemies that come close, instead they deploy actual troops. The towers have got 4 archers on the top that do the actual shooting. They can die, but they'll respawn for free. The town hall defences see a bunch of 10 melee and 10 range units come flooding out of the front door when the enemy draws close, and will try and beat them down to the best of their ability. Like the archers in the tower, they can be killed, but also like the archers, they'll respawn over time. You can't give orders to these defenders, but they do the job just fine. Most nations also have some sort of automated production structure that spawns 1 unit every so often until the maximum number is reached. For the Romans, it's the gladiators from the arena, and for the Persians, it's the mounted archers from the auxiliary stables. Unlike the town centre units, you can give orders to these troops, but they will still replenish their numbers without cost when they die. I think it's also worth mentioning the naval combat, as it works very differently than any other RTS that comes to mind. Instead of a load of boats rowing around, firing arrows out of the ether at each other, each boat is just a platform for troops. Put archers on it, you've got a ranged attack boat. Put swordsmen on it and you've got yourself a boarding party. You can then build some sailors who will use their grappling hooks to pull you alongside the enemy, so your swordsman can run over and butcher the unlucky occupants. Once you've done that, the boat's now yours and is added to your navy. There are also allowances for stuff like ramming speed based on distance and positioning, and the slaves who actually power the boat will unhappily work for whoever is standing on the top deck. It's a really cool system that fits both the game and the time period really well, and honestly I found the naval part of the game a damn sight more innovative and enjoyable than any of the hero mechanics. All of these features add up to a huge amount of innovative new ways of doing things, and it really sets the game apart from other RTSs of the era. But the problem is that these things don't seem to add up to a great experience. When you've got a really powerful hero unit to control, it immediately makes everything else in your army feel underwhelming. The automated defences and automatically replenished units are a cool way of doing things, but have a tendency to make attacks long and drawn out even though the eventual outcome is never in doubt. The outpost mechanic is neat, but it makes a comeback very difficult when your opponent is paying half the cost for the troops that you are. And the training system means that it's of great benefit to you to just sit there and not do anything for as long as possible. These issues are especially prevalent in skirmish mode, and the complex nature of many of the interactions is completely beyond the comprehension of the game's limited AI. On my first game it managed to wall itself off and did nothing for half an hour, and on my second game on a more open map it continually built troops but sent them out in a long, unorganised erratic mess that just got defeated piecemeal, first by a neutral outpost and then later by my own forces. Things tended to work a lot better during the campaign due to the highly scripted nature of many of the encounters, but unfortunately the same scripting tended to make each engagement rather trivial as long as you did things the exact way the mission intended. Now it's true that the game does lack polish and things were a little buggy, but honestly that didn't really put me off at all. I've played loads of betas, early access titles and fan-made games and mods, so I can look past that sort of stuff. The game's problems go a hell of a lot deeper than that. Although it features many good ideas, I think the whole concept is flawed from the very start. You see, the thing that defines strategy games is they're not about any single individual, but instead about the whole force. The joy of these games is creating the right mix of forces for the way you want to tackle the particular task at hand, using them in a certain way, and then getting creative with what you have when the situation changes. This is why it's so difficult to successfully pull off hero units in RTS games. If you make them too weak, they're just another unit, and if you make them too strong, then they overshadow everything else. Rise and Fall doesn't just feature a hero, it's totally defined by it. Everything from the way you fight, to the way you tech, to the way buildings are rendered revolves around something that is at odds with the entire genre. Without the massive hero powers, your army is weak. Without spending glory on leveling up your hero, you can't unlock upgrades. And as the same currency is used for both, you must always make a choice to either spend it on advancement or hero levels. All that said, I did quite enjoy some of the game, and I found myself frequently impressed when I did find these new features, but I always had the most fun when I was in the RTS view, ordering around my big squares of troops and breaking things with the elephants and ramming speed. I think there is a lot that other games could probably take from Rise and Fall, but direct control of a godlike hero unit should not be one of them. So now we've talked about the game, let's talk about the narrative that leads up to it. First, a heavy pre-qualifier. There is very little detailed and direct information about all of this. Most people involved were pretty tight-lipped, and even if someone were to suddenly come out with a tell-all story, it would be very hard to verify they are who they say they are, that they had all of the information in the first place, and that their reporting is accurate and honest. So what follows are a few facts and quite a lot of my own conjecture. However, I'll make sure that I'm clear on which is which, and although we'll never know for sure, I'll let you decide if you think my theories are plausible. So let's talk about publishers. If you want things to go well, then both parties are heavily invested in a good relationship. The publisher wants a developer that makes great games that are delivered on time and in good working order. Back in the 2000s, the publisher's job was to get the thing printed, packaged, delivered, marketed, sold and supported. If you work with a developer who produces strong games and meets deadlines, then your job is a hell of a lot easier. Promotion is smooth, sales are higher, and customer support problems are few and far between. If you're a developer, you want a publisher who properly promotes and sells your game, provides a great return and gives you the appropriate funding arrangement and time for you to make the game that you want to make. A long-term two-way relationship based on trust and performance is highly beneficial to everyone, and it isn't something you give up just for the fun of it. So let's talk about their first publisher, Sierra. Now, back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, Sierra were the bomb. They published some absolutely groundbreaking titles, some highly innovative, some just really well executed, and many both. I'm talking Homeworld, both 1, 2 and Cataclysm. I'm talking Half-Life 1 and 2, the SWAT series, Ground Control. These weren't safe but dull, easy mass-market crowd pleasers. They were cutting-edge, experimentative and interesting. It's hard to imagine the Sierra of this period heavily restricting your creative vision. Now let's talk about the earlier years of Activision. It's just one big hitter after another. Battlezone, Total War, Call of Duty. Again, certainly not a publisher that lacked vision. Stainless Steel had problems working with Sierra, switching after Empire Earth. They had problems again working with Activision, ending a multi-game deal after a single release. And once again they had a problem with Midway. Now obviously I don't know why things soured between each of them, but I do know that in every one of those pairings there was one thing in common. I think Raylan Givens says it best.
You ever hear the saying, you run into an asshole in the morning, you ran into an asshole. You run into assholes all day, you're the asshole.
So let's talk about the circumstances surrounding the winding up of Stainless Steel. First, we know a few things based on press releases and some verified forum posts. The game was slated for an October 2005 launch. We don't know when in October, let's be generous and say it's the last week. That would mean that you would need to have the master, or gold discs, ready by mid-October, as it takes at least a week or two to get those discs copied, the boxes and manuals printed and the final product delivered to retailers. The first whispers we get about the studio closing were on the 23rd of November, and employees state that the game was almost ready and just 2 weeks away from going gold. This would result in a launch date in the final week of December, or in other words, 2 months late. But hey, I hear you say, 2 months isn't a big deal, especially when we're talking about a 2 or 3 year project. Surely no publisher would take massive issue with what amounts to a 5% overrun. Well, you see, that's the thing, and once again we run into a fact that's never really reported. You see, when Stainless Steel started on Rise and Fall, it was either off of their own back or with a different publisher. This only came to my attention because of a single throwaway line on a forum post about the game having no publisher for a year. And sure enough, after digging through a load of old press releases, I found confirmation. Midway only announced they had signed a publishing agreement with Stainless Steel in February 2005, just 8 months before the release date. This means that our 2-month delay is actually a 25% overrun rather than the 5% we initially thought, and something that sounds altogether more significant. So let's jump back to our original claim. Midway pushed the release date back 5 months, but refused to make any more payments for development, forcing Stainless Steel to close. Now this is where things get interesting. This did indeed happen, but the narrative would have us believe that the closure was immediate fallout of the decision to push the deadline back. But why would a publisher push back the release of a video game? Publishers like to make money. Not selling anything is at odds with that desire, so they would need a damn good reason to do so. I can think of 3 possible reasons. The first is if it clashes with a competing project. If you are releasing a multiplayer shooter, you might not want it to hit the shelves the same day as Call of Duty, so you'd have a good reason to push it back a week or two. Perhaps you want to time it with a particular holiday or occasion. If you had a World War II game focusing on the Normandy landings with a planned 30th of May release date, it might be tempting to push it back a week so it arrives on D-Day. Both of these are normally short-term delays. So what about the third reason? Development just isn't progressing as fast as it should and the game won't be ready on time. Midway, being a big corporate beast, publishes a quarterly report which I managed to find, and this gives us a little bit of insight. It states that with the expectation of a crowded fourth quarter for strategy titles, we believe it is prudent to shift Rise and Fall to 2006 to benefit from a less competitive release window. I did some checking, and Black and White 2, Age of Empires 3 and Civilization 4 all had October 2005 release dates, so some sort of pushback definitely makes a lot of sense. Christmas is a great time to sell things, and there wasn't anything big slated for November or December. You generally want to push things back as little as possible because you can't earn any money without actually releasing the game. Remember, quarterly reports aren't true statements of every fact, they're a brief summary, so it seems very plausible to me that part of the reason they decided to move the date back so far was it needed that amount of additional development time. I did see a claim that Midway did it to improve their Q1 2006 figures, but honestly there's absolutely no evidence to support this. The decision to release in 2006 forced Midway to revise its estimated revenues down and estimated losses up, and that's really not something you want to have to do in a quarterly report if you can help it, as it does not give shareholders and investors a lot of confidence. It's also worth noting that this report is in the second quarter and was published at the start of August. This means that the decision to move the release date was made between April and July, some 4 to 7 months before Stainless Steel abruptly down tools and closed up shop. To get a true understanding of the financial implications relies on the exact terms of the deal between Midway and Stainless Steel. Things are a bit different these days, and there's always a lot of room for variation, but back then there were 4 main methods of funding: flat fee contract work, recoupable development fee, co-production and royalties. Flat fee is simple. The publisher says, "We want a game, we'll pay you a load of money." The studio develops it and they get their cash. It's not often in a single lump sum, but more likely in advance and then milestone payments. So if it's a $2 million game, the developer might get $500,000 up front, another $500,000 when the first alpha is available, a further $500,000 when it gets to beta, and then another $500,000 when the game is finished and ready to ship. Recoupable development fee is kind of similar, but instead of being paid for the game, you're given advances out of the possible revenue that the game will make once it goes on sale. With this option, the publisher still advances the developer cash when certain milestones are met, but the developer won't see any royalty payments until the sum of all their advances is covered by product sales. They might, however, retain ownership of the product depending on the terms of the deal. Co-development is a bit more complicated, but usually happens when both parties have something to bring to the table and revenue is split. Perhaps the developer will supply the game engine, whereas the publisher supplies the intellectual property rights, actors, and other valuable commodities. This is often used when you're dealing with stuff like movie tie-ins, where the value of the IP is particularly high. Finally, you've got royalties, often used when the developer owns the game and the publisher agrees to distribute and market that game for a specific cut. The particular size of that cut depends on the strength of the relationship between both parties and the perceived value of the product. Unfortunately, we don't know the details of the particular deal between the developer and the publisher in this case, but we do have a couple of clues. We know that Midway wasn't involved from the start and it's a new IP, which probably rules out any flat fee or co-production deals. German-based GameStar.de reported that Rick Goodman told them Midway cut off advances to Stainless Steel after the release date was pushed back from October to early 2006. The word advances here is of particular interest to us, as it suggests that they had a deal at least partly based on royalties, with Midway providing Stainless with advances against future revenue in order for them to fund the rest of the development. In this way, advances work a bit like a loan. The developer says, "Hey, we've got this great project that's half complete, but we don't have enough money to finish it." The publisher says, "We love your project. We'll give you the money to finish the game in the format of milestone payments, and then take that money back out of the royalties you'll earn from future sales." Just like any sort of lending, this can be a risky business. If a publisher aims to sell 500,000 copies at $30 a pop and give the developer a 30% cut, that's $4.5 million you can afford to loan them. But what if you only sell 100,000 copies? Suddenly their royalty payments only add up to $1 million, which is not a lot of comfort if you've advanced them $2 million for development. Now that you have an idea how these deals are structured, you might be thinking to yourself, does moving the actual release date back a few months really constitute that much of a problem? Unless you sign the dumbest deal ever, you'll get your final milestone payment when the project is actually ready to ship, not when it hits the shelves. The royalties themselves are a slow process. Sure, your game might go on to sell 1 million copies, but it's not going to do that on day one, and the money moved a lot slower back in those days. Royalties could easily be calculated on a quarterly basis, and the first few checks will be offset against any advances that you were paid. If you did develop a project with an advance on royalties, I doubt you'd see any additional money in the first 6 months unless it sold way above expectations. When Stainless Steel went under, Midway actually went ahead and finished the game themselves. It's a tough task working on someone else's project, as one of the Stainless staff recognised when they said the work left on the game was about 2 weeks for us, but another developer jumping into a completely unfamiliar codebase, it could take them several months to finish this work. It actually took Midway some 6 months to complete and launch the game, so on the surface this claim looks correct, but again I think we need to unpack it just a little. For one thing, I'm not sure if the term completely unfamiliar codebase is a fully accurate description of the situation. You remember I mentioned earlier that the game was developed on the Titan 2.0 engine, the engine that was licensed out to other studios. You can't license out something like this without documentation and a certain amount of usability, so I think another developer may be in a slightly better position than you might imagine. What's also interesting is that though we always hear that Midway finished the game themselves, that's not strictly true. For the actual programming, they subcontracted another firm called Pacific Beach Digital. Pacific Beach Digital are a specialised outfit with a very narrow focus. They fix up other people's projects. If you look at their promo material, it's easy to see why they were chosen. Collectively, the members of Pacific Beach Digital have written every system in a modern computer game several times over. This gives us the unique ability to step into any project, troubleshoot any system and get it to ship. So my question is simple, was the game really 2 weeks away from completion? It took Midway's San Diego studio and the experts at Pacific Beach Digital 6 months to complete the project. The game's manual is also a bit of an eye-opener as it actually separates both Midway's and Stainless Steel's contributions to the project. After the development restarted in the new year and in the 6 months that followed, Midway made use of a localization manager, 35 voice actors, 3 motion capture artists, 2 programmers, 4 level designers, a scriptwriter, and more than 20 product analysts and QA testers. I'll let you into a little secret. If your game is just 2 weeks away from going gold, it's pretty much finished. You've not got time to do any major bug fixing or feature work as there won't be enough time to test it thoroughly before the discs are set in stone. During this period you're making final adjustments, tweaking the voice lines and cinematics, testing your multiplayer service and writing your game manual. What you're not doing is adding a big bunch of extra campaign story, units and maps, translating and adding voice acting for Spanish, German, French and Italian, and fixing a huge array of bugs. But is this an accurate representation of the remaining work? In an interview with Midway's Mark Caldwell a few months before final release, he states that quite a lot was lost in transition, and they had to recreate the alpha version of the game from an archive of code and data. This could go some way to explain why they had so much extra work to do, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. On the one hand, you could take it to mean that Stainless Steel's version was far more complete, but on the other hand, Mark says that deciphering it really didn't take that long, and that by March they already had the game back to the state before the developer shut down. It's also worth noting that Mark is the executive producer rather than a programmer or project lead, so it would be in his interest to make the task sound rather difficult and therefore their final results more impressive. One thing that makes this whole situation so frustrating to me as a genuinely interested party is how little information came out at the time or since. Midway had nothing much to say at the time, apart from a very bland one-line press release stating they had parted ways with Stainless Steel and giving a new release date. A few of the employees at Stainless Steel Studios did make some short statements that can be summarised by the sentence, "Everything was going amazingly, morale was high, the game was an absolutely revolutionary title that would change the genre forever, and we feel for the fans who might never get to play our fantastic game." Okay, I'm exaggerating slightly, but not by too much. The only other thing they were happy to talk about was the fact they weren't allowed to talk about it. With these brief and vague statements, they managed to imply that everything at Stainless Steel Studios was top-notch and the blame must lie elsewhere. The users on the Heaven Games forums, where the news broke, idolised Stainless Steel, and due to the lack of any actual information, collectively decided that Midway were to blame. Well, most of them did. A few cool heads suggested waiting for the facts to come out, but those people were quickly drowned out by others who claimed that their fanatical support for Stainless Steel gave their harebrained theories more credibility. The problem for us is the facts never did come out. It's highly likely that the employees at Stainless Steel Studios had signed non-disclosure agreements when they joined the company, and that those contracts prevented them from divulging anything about the projects or the dealings of the company at the time. This makes total sense. After all, you don't want people spreading information that could damage your reputation or the reputation of your partners, and nor do you want them leaking your intellectual property. But NDAs aren't sort of magic gagging order that prevents everything forever. Most have a time frame, something in the region of 2 to 5 years depending on the relevance of the information involved, and normally they've got to be quite specific in their terms. The broader an NDA, the less likely it is to be enforced by a court, especially if that information no longer has any commercial value. Indefinite NDAs are possible, and if your company or some of its intellectual property is sold, then your obligations may pass to the new owning entity. But if the company ceases to exist without this happening, then there is no longer anyone to be obligated to. Stainless Steel were not bought or sold off piecemeal, they simply ceased trading and then were later dissolved. What's my point? Well, we're 20 years on. Stainless no longer exists. Midway no longer exists. Does this mean that everyone is hiding some huge truth? No, of course not. It's probably more of a sign that events unfolded in a way that was both unglamorous and predictable. So let's talk a little about Midway. Midway were a big company, sure, but they were not a profitable one. They may have had sales north of 150 million a year, but they made a loss of 20 million in 2004 and a whopping 120 million in 2005. They might have looked like they had very deep pockets, but in reality those pockets were just full of fluff and dreams and loan agreements. It was a company in decline. In the year 2000 they were the number 4 video game publisher by sales. By 2005 that had dropped off to number 19. Over the next few years they continued to borrow more, make less, and by 2010 had gone through liquidation and wrapped up completely. Suffice to say, Midway was not the sort of publisher that had a lot of free cash floating around and not one that could afford to fund a project indefinitely. So where's all this leading? Well, this is my theory. And remember, theory, not fact. The talented guys over at Stainless Steel Studios are working on their next game. They've been self-funding it for over a year and things are looking really exciting, but the royalties from their last 2 games aren't enough to cover their operating costs. So they strike up a deal with Midway. Midway will publish their game when it's completed and will pay Stainless Steel a certain percentage of sales as royalties. Midway will also pay a number of advances at certain milestones against the royalties so that Stainless Steel can afford to pay their wage bill while they finish up development. An October release is agreed by both parties, with the amounts of advance cash promised based on this deadline. Development does not proceed as planned. The project is too ambitious for the time allotted. Rick Goodman refuses to compromise his creative vision, hires too many people, and things start to get very expensive. Midway are concerned about the October release date due to some other big hitters arriving on the scene about the same time, so there's probably some discussion with Stainless Steel about the best time to reschedule for. This works in everyone's favour, as Midway wants to avoid the October clashes and Stainless needs more time to finish the game. Finances are tight, but the number crunchers at Stainless Steel think they can make things work as they will still get a final big milestone payment from Midway once the product is ready to ship, no matter when the actual release date is. Unfortunately for Stainless Steel Studios, the development problems continue. They needed that big final payment before the end of the year or the coffers would be empty, but the game just isn't progressing fast enough. Their original planned completion date of mid-October comes and goes, and another month passes and the game still isn't ready. At this point, Stainless Steel asks Midway for another advance on their prospective royalties to make ends meet, but Midway declines. Maybe they can't afford it. Maybe they take a look at the current state of the product and realise there's still a hell of a lot more to be done. Maybe they think the game just isn't that good and they won't get their money back. Perhaps they make a counteroffer, but it's not one that Stainless Steel can accept, and they are at an impasse. Without enough in the bank to cover the next month's wages, Stainless Steel is forced to cease operations, and that's the end of that. I think it's worth remembering what we mentioned earlier, that income from royalties takes time. If you spend your last penny on the day before release, you're still in very, very deep trouble. Even if you've got just enough in the tank at the end of the project to keep your studio alive with a skeleton staff while you wait 12 months for the bulk of your royalties to arrive, you're still going to have to lay off all of your developers, designers and artists unless you've got a new project and publishing deal waiting in the wings. What I've got no idea about is how Midway ended up with the full rights to the game. Perhaps it was intended from the start, or perhaps there was a non-delivery clause in the contract. I'm pretty sure there wasn't a final deal when they parted ways, as otherwise Midway would have been provided with a complete and final version of the code and Rick Goodman's name wouldn't have been wiped from the credits. Time and time again we hear stories about developers being screwed over by the publisher. It's a comfortable narrative, the smart, creative and hard-working little guy versus the big, evil, money-grabbing corporation. But we're all grown-ups here. None of these people are running a charity. They all have a business-to-business agreement and everything they do costs a lot of money. I'm a software developer myself. If you make promises to develop a certain product in a certain amount of time or to a certain budget, it's your job to stick to that. Sometimes you've got to leave a few features out. Sometimes you have to rein in your own pet projects, and sometimes you've got to settle for okay in areas that aren't of critical importance. This is why it's good to have a long-running relationship with a client, as it can grant you a little wiggle room. But this was Stainless Steel's first game with Midway, and as far as I can tell they had full creative control over the project, so any delays are going to be of their own making. This won't surprise anyone who's played Empire Earth. The amount of ambition in that game is breathtaking, but it does give you the impression that the creator does struggle with the balance between desirable, achievable and deliverable. This does not make him a bad person, nor does it make him uniquely flawed. It's a common occurrence that arises whenever art intersects with business, and is a problem as old as both of those concepts. Sure, Stainless Steel Studios probably needed some stronger project management to rein everyone in and keep them on track, but their intent was noble. They were artists, visionaries maybe, trying to create the absolute best game they could. They certainly weren't the villains in this story, but then again, I don't think Midway were either, and it's wrong to paint them as such. Midway had their own financial woes. They couldn't continue to fund a project indefinitely, and I doubt they had much in the way of free cash floating around. Their actions in regard to Stainless Steel Studios were just one of many unpleasant financial decisions they would be forced to make in order to try and stay afloat. We'll never know the full story, nor will we ever know what might have happened if Stainless Steel had stuck with Sierra or Activision, or if Midway had managed to find an extra cheeky $500,000 under the mattress. What we do know is despite all of these problems, Rise and Fall Civilizations at War was eventually released. It was a really interesting game that contained a staggering amount of innovation. Sure, the final product didn't work out quite as the creators hoped, but you need to take risks and try new things if you want to break the mold. If we're being brutally honest, even if they had finished the game themselves, I don't think it would have fixed the core problem. The genre had to learn these lessons from someone, and I still think it was an experiment worth doing. Aside from the actual game, the creation process provided vital experience for a dedicated and motivated team of developers and artists, and it's no wonder that many of them would go on to join other amazing teams in the industry and bring us titles like Dawn of War, Supreme Commander, XCOM and Bioshock. Was it a disappointment? Perhaps. A missed opportunity? I think so. But a waste of time? Certainly not. So that's Rise and Fall Civilizations at War. I don't think I'm going to be playing it much in the future, but I'm very glad I did, and I'm pleased to have added it to my collection. Hi there. Oh, that was a marathon, wasn't it? I'm not really sure if long form is my style, but just like Stainless Steel, you've got to try some new things sometimes. If you did enjoy this lengthy proceeding, then click the like button, and if you've got some thoughts on the game or maybe the development problems it had, then let me know in a comment or in the Discord. And if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.